Thank you so much, Jazz, and appreciate your leadership of WIN, and it's wonderful to work with you on the programs of WIN. It's really exciting to be here. I'd like to recognize the traditional owners, the Gadigal people. We're on their land. I'm from Dharawal land, and I spent most of my early career in Australia at the intersection between Dharawal land and Gundungurra land, the people of the coast and the people of the inland. And what's so interesting about ANSTO is that it's sort of the cusp of transformation of an energy system from what I would call a coastal energy system where you're relying on things that come out of the sea to an upland one where you're relying on things from the land. And I hope that we're in an energy transition and we can learn so much from the traditional history of our land. And I honor the people and their histories deeply and really appreciate their leadership historically on our continent. Also thinking about Jo Lackenby today. Jo would have loved to be here. I honor her. She is a remarkable person. I recently was on a television program which was a bit average, but Jo was fantastic. And average is a word that I always thought meant average, but it means something else in Australia. But it was exciting to be involved in a program with Jo because her commitment and her energy is just remarkable. And so I also wanted to honor her leadership in her absence today. And of course, Ed should be here. And I've worked a lot with Ed, you know, knowing him at ANSTO and then seeing him at UNSW, and the way that he has this kind of quiet passion and insight that you're going to miss today because I'm going to hear my rambling remarks that I was told to do at about 12:30 yesterday. And so I hope that I am a reasonably credible stand-in for Ed, who I honor and respect. This talk has been put together very quickly. In fact, the Siyeva logo is on the page twice because I was copying it when they took my stick away from me. So my logo isn't sort of double-sided like that, although it reminds me to just explain my logo briefly. Siyeva Consulting, Population 1, 80 Patterson, is worried about the heat of the planet. So the red thing at the bottom is an overheating planet. The triangle, the green triangle, is the sustainability triangle. People, profit, and all of that sort of stuff, right? That is the normal dialogue around green energy. Sustainable planet is we take that people, planet, prosperity, various versions of the 3 Ps, and it gives you a triangle. But the solution, of course, is which takes you even higher than the triangle. And that little blue thing is our Earth. You can see it's an oblate spheroid. It's not a true sphere. If you look at it very carefully, I've squashed it. This, by the way, based on my hourly rate, cost me $270 to produce. I did not go to outsource this. And you can see it's sort of transitioning from day to night, oblate spheroid. That's our Earth. And our Earth is in a better position than the red one and the green one because it's sitting on yellow cake. It actually has harnessed nuclear power, and I used yellow cake as an analogy for all nuclear power. I know there's other forms, you know, thorium and so on. But I hope that's helpful to you. And the fact that it's doubled up means that I've got to move forward. I think that's... So I want to give you a weather report. Does that mean we have to exit the building? I didn't check the safety arrangements. I don't want us to be in a building if it's not safe. So somebody will find out. I'll keep to it. No, we've been told it's perfectly safe. There are alarms regularly here. Okay. I don't want to just have a bad safety culture. So I know you've all checked for the exits and you know where they are. Now, weather report, South Australia. This is from I took this yesterday afternoon and I just wanted to bring you up to date how things are in South Australia. And on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, the wind forgot to blow. And so you can see that sort of deep blue purpley thing. That's the imports of electricity from other places in South Australia. This is, of course, the miracle that we're going to take from 1.6 million people to the whole of our population by next Wednesday. And I want to point out that there's a problem when too much wind blows, which is what happened on the 1st and 2nd of April, because you go into negative price territory. That little line across the bottom with a 0 is when you have to pay somebody because you're making too much energy. And this story, which repeats itself every week in Australia, should be a formal piece of reporting on ABC News so that people know that intermittent renewables are a danger to the social fabric of our society. By the way, the battery, if those of you can see the sort of light blue color that appears there, can anybody see that, the little light blue? That's the battery, okay? And they basically charge the battery when it's empty. It's used mainly for frequency control and makes many, many, many thousands of dollars from frequency control, but it empties. So they charge the battery, and then sometimes they actually use energy from the battery, and that's what I call the small blue dot that is not on my logo. And so I think we need to really understand. By the way, opennem.org.au is a free-to-air look at the grid in detail. You can do the whole of Australia, you can do all of it. It's really important to explain to people who you know and love that our electricity is deeply unreliable if it's going to be based on the South Australian model. And South Australia doesn't really produce anything that requires energy. Okay, it requires thought, but not a lot of energy. And there's sort of a steel mill just hanging on by its fingernails. They built a solar thermal plant that never worked, that was apparently going to make that one work. So I don't want to overemphasize the problem we have with dilute renewable sources. So I thought I'd take us back to the beginning. The experimental breeder reactor in what used to be the Argonne National Laboratory West in Idaho. It's now the Idaho National Lab, which is going to be the home to a new reactor, which we just heard about. Why is it at the Idaho National Laboratory? It's on federal land. You do not have to deal with any of the states who want the electrons. So it's really important to recognize that in order to provide the people who want those electrons, the easiest way is to go to a national lab. I hope that the Idaho National Lab also gets their extra unit in there because I'm interested to see how the crane works. So that will be good. January the 11th, 1954, Time magazine, front page. This is before I was born, by the way. Admiral Rickover on the front page. Nuclear submarines, called atomic submarines in those days. In sea power, another revolution is the subtext at the bottom there. Admiral Rickover was a force of nature. He was an absolute remarkable man. He had in his mental architecture all of the necessary elements that lead to a successful nuclear program. And that architecture that was in his head, he imposed onto the structures that he created to build those first nuclear reactors that went into submarines. And the legacy of the US Navy's nuclear submarines is a truly remarkable legacy, because they had the bones not of a nuclear reactor in the back of a submarine, but a propulsion unit that sustained life of people underwater. It's very different to a nuclear reactor. It is the right nuclear reactor. It is designed for all of its purposes, not just to produce electrons. In fact, today, the long-tail positive legacy of Admiral Rickover is that we should be talking more about sustainability of life on our planet than we should be talking about electricity. And that's one of the key points that I want to make in my talk today. So the paradigm of a nuclear submarine is basically a nuclear battery. You can't be putting wires in there all the time. In fact, you don't want wires connected to your nuclear submarine because they're kind of a bit of a giveaway. Your hydrodynamics will fail and you won't get very far. So that's why it is a nuclear battery. It's autonomous And one of his insights was, if you can possibly build it for the lifetime of the environment in which it operates, you don't have to get it in and out all of the time. You can do other things and so on. I think it would bear a lot of consideration for Australia to really understand the deep history of the US nuclear program and the importance of a structure that is in there for the long journey but starts out on the correct journey. Now, I spent a lot of my life thinking about electricity. More recently, when I've seen what people want to do with electricity, and in fact, Elon Musk, who I once had lunch with, is a really interesting example of a maverick who is changing how we think about motor vehicles, for example. So we don't want to just have electricity for our houses, we want them in our motor vehicles. In fact, if we want to move goods around Australia, we probably want to have trains that are based on new forms of electricity, probably not batteries, but the problem is that electricity is only a tiny fraction of our energy requirements. And this diagram, which is from the latest statistics from the Key World Energy Statistics of the International Energy Organization, which, by the way, is not an international body, it's a rich person's body. If you come from the rest of the world, like Africa, where I do, there's only 2 members of the IEA in the whole of Africa, a continent of 54 nations. And so it only represents rich blokes, usually. And this is their picture of the future for the rich world, okay? And you can see that yellow thing there is electricity. Underneath it is biofuels and waste, natural gas, oil and coal. If you think by electrifying with dilute renewables what we can already electrify with nuclear power plants, you are sadly mistaken. We will not deal with carbon dioxide problems by doing electrification with dilute resources. It is simply not possible to achieve that goal. I hope if you see nothing else in this talk, you take this diagram, and I'm happy for this to be sort of distributed and randomly handed to your friends. It's really important to recognize that it's not the electricity system which has to be transformed, it is the energy system which has to be transformed. And when we are finished with electricity, we have to multiply by 5 the number of wind turbines and solar panels that we have, and then you've got to store a lot of that electricity, so let's multiply it by 10, and then you might be getting close to decarbonizing the electricity of the system of the world for those countries that are in the International Energy Agency. And then you've got to do the other 930 million people in the world who are electricity deficient or just don't even have it yet. It's really, really important to get this message across to our politicians and others. The challenge is energy. Low carbon electricity is important. It's a good place to start. But please remember that dilute sources distort, distract, and delay. We need predictable, timely energy. It's got to be low carbon, preferably lowest carbon. So I don't mind where that lowest carbon energy comes from, but I am truly concerned for the world in which we live. The echo chambers of self-confidence about our energy future are deeply dangerous to our society and indeed probably to democracy around the world. We just had a question about Germany, for example, where everything that they've built in terms of wind and solar has replaced the nuclear energy that they've switched off. That's just where they've got to. So they had a chance to have the nuclear energy and the dilute renewables, but all that they have managed to do in switching off the nuclear is replacing it with the dilute renewables. They haven't even started with the rest of the electricity problem. That's why they're buying gas from Russia. That's why the European Union says that nuclear and renewables and gas are the same. All right, so it's energy, not electricity. But if you have to make electricity, delta T is the universal rule. It is the difference between the temperature at which the electrons are produced and room temperature. That is the only important principle for electricity production for a sustainable planet forever. So sorry I couldn't put a delta in there, but I wanted this to be for a general audience, so I spelt it out in letters. Delta T. If you remember one thing about today, about electricity, if you have a high temperature source of electricity, you have got a chance of decarbonizing the planet and getting to the lowest carbon that we need to get to, delta T. Now, we can prove this because Tom Mason, the director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, a number of years ago, this is probably at least 6 or 7 years old, did an analysis over 25 to 30 years of the electricity emissions per capita, CO2 per capita, produced by a number of countries. And I've put arrows next to the countries that were able to change the trajectory. So look, we've got Australia's in a fascinating position because you can see how we produce more electricity over time, and we increase the per capita CO2 per ton of electricity over time. But the United States, the United Kingdom, and France went on a different trajectory. This was not bad political management in the United Kingdom, okay? It was great political management. They actually reduced the amount of carbon dioxide per capita during the nuclear build program in the United Kingdom. It is a remarkable achievement. Bad people on this graph go up to the top corner. Good people flatten it out or slow it down. Look at France. France has moved across that diagram and has itself lowered its CO2 per capita over the period of time, which is why they are correctly and rationally going back to nuclear again. It is not possible to have a world that we want to live in if we do not understand that the only technology which has demonstrated a break with the history of CO2 production that you can see on a graph and which is absolutely incontrovertible is nuclear power. There is no other way that we can do this that has been demonstrated by any country, except Brazil, down in the corner. Brazil is on biofuels. Now, the reason that they've been able to do their development trajectory is because most of their transport fleet is based on biofuels. And they've got engines that actually run on essentially distorted sugarcane. You take sugarcane, you grow it, you turn it into something else, and it works. And so I give credit to Brazil for getting a developmental agenda that has been relatively successful for their people and keeping a very low carbon footprint. So advanced reactors and SMR, small modular reactors, what is the more attractiveness profile that we need in order to look at that? Well, let's start off, they have to be safer. Inherent safety is better than planned safety. And so you really get inherent safety, reasonable safety, planned safety, and then not so safe, okay? And it's really important to think about designing reactors where inherent safety, and I'll come back to what I mean by inherent safety, is built into the design. My view is they need to be smaller. Most small reactors start off smaller than they end up because the people who want the electrons make them bigger. And normally that is a fatal flaw of the smaller reactors, is instead of getting to series production, they become a big small reactor, and building a big small reactor is a problem. I was involved in one of those projects called the PBMR. We had a beautiful, elegant Siemens design from Germany. It was a cylinder, and the decision was taken at a certain point to put an annular thing down the middle because we wanted to increase the power. Now, if you take a cylinder that's full of pebbles, it's quite easy to manage. You put a straw down the middle, not so easy to manage. All right? That was a really big challenge for that project. So there's a universal law that smaller is better. For the reason is that you can then go to the law of multiples. You can make lots of those small things, and by making lots of those small things efficiently, you can build them in factories. And because they are smaller, they've got some chance of being inherently safe. And therefore, you can eliminate the emergency planning zone. I'll come back to that in a minute. The reason that delta T is important is you can then use the heat from that reactor not just to produce electrons, but to do a whole lot of other things. You can actually get into producing other things out of that. The capital model is simpler if you can get your regulator to regulate one of these reactors, and they become very confident in it, and it doesn't need an emergency planning zone. There's nobody in your community who can panic anymore. And as a result of that, community acceptance goes up. The capital model comes down by about 30% if you don't have to persuade communities that they love nuclear. All right, straight away, because you don't have to bolt on a whole lot of things. You can also do remote deployment. Because if it is a very simple reactor, you can actually train people who are non-nuclear specialists to be the coordinators, organizers, and deployer of that resource. In terms of the fuel, you can buy it, burn it, and return it in some of these settings, and you can take a shared approach to licensing. I think these are the things that people forget when they're doing a technical sell on why their reactor is the best reactor to buy. Smaller, compact reactors that are easy to replicate and can be built in a factory setting are much, much more attractive than anything bigger. And I was just interested in Tony's remark about the UK reactor having got quite big. Is it still a small reactor? I know what the pressure is. I know what they're saying to them. Need more electrons. Right, we'll make it a bit bigger. Oops. All right. So here's reactors in the developmental risk space. Coming up, we go from new entrants to a global integrated nuclear industry. Coming across, we go design improvement, design evolution, design revolution. This is quite a useful diagram that was developed at ANSTO. And current nuclear power, large, slow to build, expensive upfront. Very few exceptions to that rule. Current SMRs are kind of in the design revolution corner mostly. New technologies in development require demonstration. What we need for future SMRs is a fleet-based approach. Smaller, faster to build, an international regulatory approach. If we can get regulators to do what we did with civil aviation, every country used to have its own civil aviation authority. Once we decided that flying to other countries was useful, they developed an international approach to aviation regulation, and it's largely been successful. Now we're trying to save the planet. It's really important that we have an international regulatory approach so that the people of Canada do not have to experience the NRC, for example, which for them would be very traumatic. Canada's got one of the best regulators in the world, by the way, in my humble opinion. Based on the Scottish method of regulating, because most of the good ideas in Canada are arrived from Scotland. Tony Ewan, would you agree with me? And so basically very pragmatic, and knows that when things are not working, you really do need them to get better, and you create a context for that to happen. Factory assembly. Factory assembly is really, really important, and we've got to close the fuel cycle. You cannot rely on the nuclear operator to be worried about the fuel. So this is the vision for how we have to do the work. So nuclear fission in Australia, you've got France as a vendor, you've got Canada as a driver at the moment, bottom corner of the IAEA roadmap. The good news is Australia is a member of the Generation 4 International Forum. We are the only non-nuclear power country in the world to be a member of the Generation 4 International Forum, and it is crucial that that technically oriented, this is not a political forum, this is a forum of engineers who understand nuclear. That technical forum needs Australian technical leadership to advance our membership as the only non-nuclear country that is involved in that forum. This is not a talking shop for sort of ex-CEOs like me. It's practical, hands-on, nuclear experts doing the work. So, if we've got to do that in Australia, how are we going to do it? Well, if you look at the nuclear commitment scale, also developed in ANSTO by Jared Powell and Kubis Nandir, At the moment, we are not exiting because we've never entered, but we are definitely excluded. So I love all those E's: embedded, emergent, engaged, excluded. Please remember that and write it down. Delta T. It is all about having high temperature energy. One option is ITER, very high temperature. Australia is the first non-ITER country to have a formal relationship with ITER. Unfortunately, at the moment, that relationship is not managed. Sorry, someone's trying to phone me. Probably telling I'm talking too long. The ITER relationship is not funded by government and is sort of teetering on the edge. I would urge Australia to refund its relationship with ITER and to try to understand what is happening there. Australia has a fusion company called HB11 Energy. I confess that I am on the board of that company. It is an Australian startup that is looking at inertial confinement as opposed to high temperature fusion. And this morning I was on a early morning call, 6 o'clock in the morning, with a range of international experts who are working with Australia on that project. And then, of course, we've got the Generation 4 International Forum, which, as I've indicated, is the brains trust of so many of the new designs. So, do we want a tokamak? I'm not sure about tokamaks. In spite of the fact that ITER is doing the ITER project and after that the demo project, I think it could be too challenging. I think the inertial confinement pathway where you've got hydrogen and boron is going to be better. All of the other reactors that we normally talk about are being thought about somewhere in the world. This is the US clusters. So I decided today not to pick a winner or talk about a winner that I thought could work, because I think one of them has been built already, and this is the HTRPM, a pebble bed gas-cooled reactor built in China and connected to the grid on 20th December last year. This is a grid-connected, high-temperature gas-cooled pebble bed modular reactor, and it took a great burden off me to know that there's one working in the world now. So, electrons, process heat, nuclear medicine, spent fuel does not equal waste. Those are the things that we need for the future. So how do we decide on which future technology? Well, I'll wrap it up now. It's going to be maturity or ambition. I think we've got to go for the light green top corner, where we try to take the most mature technologies with great ambition into the future. So the choice is this: nuclear in our Australian future. Are we going to be relevant in our region or not? A non-nuclear Australia will increasingly become irrelevant in our region. The choice is ours. It's a geopolitical question. It's not an electrons question. It's not a fight between us and renewables. It's a fight for us to maintain our position in the southern end of the Pacific. Part of that might be nuclear submarines, but there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that if we are not a nuclear energy country, we will become irrelevant in the early 2050s. Thank you.